Warnke Lecture on International Security. I am Tim Naftali, faculty scholar at the Institute of Global Politics at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs, and I will be presiding over this evening's discussion. The Paul C. Warnke Lecture on International Security was established in 2002 and is dedicated to the memory of Paul Warnke, member and former director of the Council on Foreign Relations. The lecture commemorates his legacy of courageous service to the nation and to international peace. I might add, when I was a graduate student, I helped organize a visit that he made to the Nizza School of Advanced International Studies, where he talked about his commitment to a safer world and arms control. So I feel a sense of the closing of a circle today by being in this position, and I'm so grateful to the Council for asking me to participate tonight. We are thrilled to have Stephen Warnke and two of his children, Paul and Annie, with us here tonight, and are grateful to him for his family's generosity and continued involvement at CFR. I am equally grateful and delighted to be sharing this stage, not only with Brian virtually, but also with two public servants and policy intellectuals who have devoted their careers to making our world a safer place. Lynn Ruston served as the Senior Director for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation on the White House National Security Council staff, and held positions at the State Department, including Chief of Staff for the Bureau of International Security and Non-Proliferation, and Senior Advisor in the Bureau of Arms Control, Verification and Compliance. Andrew Weber served for 5.5 years as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear, Chemical, and Biological Defense Programs. He was a driving force behind the Nunn-Lugar initiative, about which we'll talk about a little bit more later. I can't imagine a more talented, committed group of public servants to talk about the issues that Brian and his team raised in that dramatic episode that we saw tonight. And so I'd like to start with Lynn and ask you, Lynn, Brian's episodes are about nuclear danger. As you think about the world we live in today, would you assess that we are in a world of more nuclear danger than we were in the Cold War, as much nuclear danger, or less nuclear danger than we faced in those terrible years of the Cold War?
Well, thanks for the question, Tim. I will answer, but I just want to take a moment first to say, what a powerful, powerful documentary and episode. I had seen this one before, but watching it again, it was just as gripping and just as thought-provoking, frankly, as the others. So thank you. And I also want to thank the Council for having me. It's really an honor to be part of the Warnke remembrance. It's not kind of dropped from my resume, but my very first job in the executive branch was working in the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, which Paul Warnke led. And one of my early mentors was Spurgeon Keeney, who was very close to him. So I feel his legacy. So now I'll answer your question, because part of the problem is his brilliant legacy is crumbling. I'd say the world is, we're in a more dangerous place than the Cold War. And of course, the Cold War was dangerous. It's easy now to look back and say, well, there was stability, there was, it was a bipolar relationship. We got through it without the use of nuclear weapons, and that's true, but we also know there was some element of luck in that. We came close to intentional use. We now know through historical examples, we came closer to accidental use of nuclear weapons than we understood at the time. And look at where we are now. We're in a world of multipolar nuclear states. We have significant tensions with Russia, and with China. China's a rising nuclear power. All of the guardrails and the agreements that have been built over time, primarily to regulate US and Soviet and Russian competition that Paul Warnke was so involved in creating himself, have really eroded, and there's very little left in place. And then we have emerging technologies like cyber and AI that make even more complicated the interaction of nuclear weapon systems and with humans and with technologies and the risks that they could be used. So there's a lot happening, which is, I would say, makes the world a more dangerous and a more complex place.
Andy, how did you mess things up so much? No, and in fact, the opposite. Andy, I'm going to ask you about a remarkable effort that you helped lead to reduce the number of nuclear weapons in the world. It's an unusual example of congressional efficiency. So that alone makes it worth thinking about. Could you talk a little bit about your experience with the Nunn-Lugar initiative, what went right and what wasn't finished?
Well, thank you. And Brian, thank you for telling this story in a way that will have such educational value for generations to come. So I was a young Foreign Service officer. I volunteered to go to this new country called Kazakhstan to work for Ambassador Bill Courtney, who's here tonight. And thanks to the vision of two senators, Sam Nunn from Georgia, and a Democrat, and Dick Lugar from Indiana, and the Nunn-Lugar Act. They had the vision, as the Soviet Union was collapsing, that all of a sudden Soviet strength, our enemy, the new security challenge was the weakness of the Soviet Union and the possibility that nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction would be diverted to rogue states or used by terrorists. And so it was that weakness that we face. And they crafted legislation with assistance from people like Ash Carter and Bill Perry to deal with that messy situation. And in 1992, I read an article in the Wall Street Journal about American Embassy Almaty looking for diplomats who find Paris a bore. And I volunteered the next day to go there. I went into Russian language training. And at the time we were just doing our jobs, you don't realize that you're involved in a historic moment or the unfolding of history. But if there's one takeaway from this incredible Netflix series, it's that individuals matter. And two of my heroes, Sam Nunn and Dick Lugar, changed history, and it's what didn't happen, the catastrophe that didn't happen for those 30 plus years that we can all be thankful for.
One segue to the subject of tonight's episode, though, is that among the countries that had to be convinced to give up their nuclear weapons was Ukraine. And many Americans don't know that commitments were made to Ukraine and its people. Might you share those with us, please?
Well, the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Russian Federation, at the request of the government of Ukraine, gave assurances that their territorial sovereignty and independence would be protected. And those were not lived up to. And Russia, in a terribly destructive and violent and needless way, has resorted to a barbaric war. But the decision to give up nuclear weapons that were on the territories of Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Ukraine, in addition to the Russian Federation, those were historic decisions by courageous leaders at the time. And the Nunn-Lugar efforts facilitated those courageous decisions because we agreed to help them securely dismantle, in accordance with treaty obligations, the INF Treaty,
Start.
and the START Treaty, to eliminate those nuclear weapons and the missiles to deliver them. So 3 countries that possessed at the time of their independence huge arsenals of nuclear weapons peacefully gave them up, and it was all done without firing a shot.
Brian, when you started and you and your team started this dramatic program, you did not know what the situation would be like in Ukraine by the time you completed this documentary. What did you learn as you were going through doing these interviews, collecting phenomenal film, videos? What did you learn about the lessons of the Cold War for now that were useful or could be useful today as you brought the series to where we are at this moment in Ukraine?
First of all, you guys can hear me? Thank you again very much for letting us screen this tonight. When we started this, I think we started this series about 2 months before Russia invaded Ukraine. And at the time, what we were thinking about a lot and what I was kind of worried about was, and Liz and Andy both just touched on this, but the nuclear treaties. So that's sort of one of the things that made us want to create this series, and also to tie it and try to understand our current moment based on the Cold War. So that before we ended up, mostly for obvious reasons, started framing the series with Putin's invasion. But we started thinking about nuclear weapons treaties, and one of the certainly one of the more celebrated aspects of the Cold War was that these various moments of relative cool-headedness during this period of time. The superpowers were actually able to achieve some of these treaties, and so that as a chronology was really important to us. The nuclear test ban treaty, the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, the SALT treaties, the INF treaty, which we talked to people in Europe about. That's obviously very important. Those intermediate range nuclear missiles are what would hit the capitals of Europe. So this was a very big deal. And then of course the new START and all that. And so we find ourselves, I think Liz just mentioned this, at a time when all of those things have lapsed. Trump had let the INF treaty lapse. And, I think we're 2 years or something from the New START treaty lapsing again, which would put us in a place where, we have no treaties governing the use or deployment of nuclear weapons. So as far as so this is disturbing. I think it's that if you're looking back at the Cold War, I think it would. It's a good moment to remember those times, those meetings in Reykjavik, and those times in which we were able to kind of get past. It doesn't look like any negotiation for those treaties is possible in the near future. So I think. I'm very curious to hear, obviously, Liz and Andy speak to this, but I think looking back, to answer your question, looking back at those moments of where superpowers were able to look past some of these differences and come together and try to figure out how to do something that would be so destructive to so many people, to craft new treaties, to use diplomacy to get us past this moment.
Liz, Andy, how do we create the conditions necessary for the cool-headedness to build some kind of architecture or some kind of bridge out of the situation we find ourselves in today?
Yeah, I know. It's hard to build that. I mean, it seems clear that with respect to Russia, some kind of cessation of hostilities in Ukraine is going to be a prerequisite for them to be prepared to engage with the United States. But I think, the obligation of governments and people outside who work on these issues are to continue to be, ready to have those discussions, to make clear that the door is open to negotiation and have an idea of, what it is we'll put on the table. Of course, now it's complicated as well because there's a great concern about China's expected growth in its nuclear arsenal. We had a government Biden official say just recently that in the absence of negotiations with both countries, at some point in the future, the United States may not be able to live at the New START levels. So we are, as you mentioned, the New START treaty is going to expire in February of 2026. We will then be in a completely unregulated environment in terms of any constraints on deployed strategic weapons. Leaders really matter. You made that point. I think we need bold leadership, and I believe there will be a time actually where Russia and the United States will actually agree to continue some kind of negotiations, because I actually think that it's not in Russia's interest to have the United States be unconstrained. And so I think at some point, it's kind of like both countries don't have the same priority at the same time, but I think we'll get to a point where we will. I think the situation with China is more complex. So.
Andy?
Yeah, I would add, we have to learn from history. I mean, at one point we had over 60,000 nuclear weapons, and arms control, as Paul Warnke was one of the leaders, well understood. It's not a Pollyannish exercise. It's not about nuclear abolition or disarmament. It's about mutual security. It's about enhancing United States security. And so, while we're witnessing and watching that episode just reinforce my belief that Putin is the last dying gasp of the Soviet Union. He's a loser. He's going to lose this. He's already, faced strategic losses, stupid, self-inflicted wounds on Russia. But we have to never forget that, as Reagan said, a nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought. And I worry about backsliding. I think the situation is much worse than it's ever been during the Cold War. We have this hot war in Europe today, and we're talking loosely about small tactical nuclear weapons. Well, these are, about the size of the weapons that we dropped on Hiroshima. So we need to delegitimize Putin's reckless brandishing of these so-called small nuclear weapons.
Lynn, you wanted to say
just one point. So Paul Warnke famously wrote an article in Foreign Policy, I think it was, called "Apes on a Treadmill," about the nuclear arms race and the senselessness of a nuclear arms race. And he made the case actually for self-restraint, for unilateral, not unilateral disarmament, but that you have to sort of figure out how much is enough in this case, and you don't have to mimic what your adversary is doing. And I think we are already entering a new era of apes on a treadmill, but there's more apes and more treadmills. And what's absent from this, I think, is much engagement from the public, certainly in our country and probably in others, to say, actually, we don't want you to be on that treadmill. That why do we need to spend trillions more on even more nuclear weapons than we have? And why aren't we going in the other direction? I mean, we may be, for the first time in 30 or 40 years, as Andy said, going down from the Cold War heights of over 30,000 to now to a few thousand, and we may now be on the cusp of going back up senselessly. I'm a trained historian, and I love calling on historical
parallels and disputing them, but at least using them as sources of questions. There is one challenge, though, that we face now that I think is a little different from the Cold War, in that we have to deter two things at the same time. One is nuclear war, and the other is conventional aggression. Because the Soviets didn't invade a Western country. They invaded Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Afghanistan. And as Mary Serrati in the episode mentioned, the historian Mary Serrati, we have this problem of deterring Putin. Since the fact we have nuclear weapons didn't deter him from invading Ukraine. And he's now bluffing, or he's now engaging in nuclear threats. To what extent should we be sensitive to not deterring ourselves in putting enough pressure on him to break his offensive in Ukraine?
So I think about this slightly differently. I mean, at one level, you could say at the strategic level, deterrence is actually working. And by that, I mean, there's a reason why Putin hasn't, for instance, struck supply lines in Poland or anywhere in NATO countries in terms of the, weapons and assistance that's going to Ukraine. And, there has been, caution exercised by President Biden and, NATO about how far we go in terms of providing assistance to Ukraine. And I think all of that is because neither Putin nor NATO nor the United States want a direct military conflict between Russia and NATO because A, that'll be a huge war, and B, it has a big risk of nuclear escalation. I mean, what is really the challenge, and it was mentioned in this, in this segment is, what we have for the first time is a nuclear power, attacking a non-nuclear country that isn't allied with nuclear countries. So there's no one's committed to its defense in that way, under cover of its nuclear weapons. And not only is it horrible for Ukraine, but it's incredibly corrosive of the whole nuclear non-proliferation regime. It's fueling proliferation pressures and anxieties amongst allies, our allies in Europe and Asia. Of course, it's combined with concern about what is the, how much and for how long and how deeply can the United States be counted on in terms of our own commitment to the security of our allies. So it's really corrosive, and there's no easy answer because the answer is that, to be frank, but I think it's true, Putin has a stronger national security interest and imperative to do the horrible things he's doing in Ukraine than we in the West have in defending Ukraine to the point of actually risking conflict with Russia. So that's just a realpolitik analysis of a really bad situation.
Andy?
Well, the basic paradox of Russia's war on Ukraine, needless war on Ukraine, is that the better Ukraine performs on the battlefield, and the more we support Ukraine in this, and we must, because it's the security of literally the free world that's at stake, the more likely Putin is to resort to nuclear weapons. And so I think it's been a ratcheting up of pressure gradually, the types of assistance that we're providing to Ukraine. Some would argue it's been a little slow to ramp up, but the squeeze is getting harder. It's going to take great endurance and diplomacy to survive this because of that basic paradox and the fact that Putin alone can decide to use nuclear weapons if he feels he's losing.
Before we turn to questions from the audience. I wanted to ask Brian. Brian, you did some great reporting from Ukraine. To what extent are they afraid in Ukraine about the possibility of the use of nuclear weapons in this crisis, in this war?
I talked to them a little bit about that, and I got a sense, just to be kind of blunt, when I talked to Zelensky, I talked to some other officials, and my impression was they're so overwhelmed with what they're dealing with there right now that it's I think it's a worry, but they have so many immediate worries on their hands that seems to be kind of obsessing their day-to-day lives. So I don't know if I have a lot of insight onto what they're thinking there, but yeah, except what Andy mentioned earlier about the fact that you get a lot of comments like we had nuclear, we were a nuclear weapon, we had nuclear weapons at one point, and we just need the full support of the United States to kind of get us through this.
Are there any questions from the audience? We have a mic, so I saw this gentleman first. So,
thank you so much. This is truly wonderful. I appreciate all of the insights that you're offering. My question is for Brian. My name is Alex. I'm an Army officer. I was most recently assigned as a instructor at the Department of Social Sciences at West Point, where we've had many spirited conversations about this documentary series on Netflix. And one of the things that I was curious about is that in some of the earlier episodes, it at least appeared to me that there was a bit of a sense that in the Khrushchev era and in the Brezhnev era, there was an undertone put in the documentary that had the United States had better communication, had we been less suspicious, and had we been a little bit more trusting of the Soviet relationship, that we would not have needed to build up as much of a stockpile of nuclear weapons as we did during the height of the Cold War in the 60s. And I'm curious if you can respond to that. Was that your intention? Do you have a different view about that? Why do you think that there was such a buildup of nuclear stockpiles in the early years? Thank you.
Well, the striking, it's funny, I think Tim speaks to this in the documentary at some point. The most striking thing I think that we were thinking about when we got that I hope is helpful, gets at your question, is this idea of the missile gap. This notion that we were driven by a kind of fear in the 50s that the first nuclear testing of the Soviet bomb, the successful test of the Soviet bomb, set off along with other things just a fear that we were seized with during that period of time, and that we built up nuclear weapons, and there was a lot of bluster on both sides. Obviously, by the time Khrushchev has the famous lines about we're building missiles like sausages. There's this dramatic building up of nuclear weapons on our side under Eisenhower. This is a political issue where people are using this. People are more than willing to sort of saying soft on the communists to gain political points. And I think that just leads to this remarkable moment where we get that first intelligence that there is a missile gap, but it's something like 1,000 to 1 in our favor, and that doesn't change our some of the ways that people, including Kennedy, are campaigning on this idea of the missile gap and using the fear of that comes out of the Cold War in order to just to score political points. So I hope, I don't know if that gets directly at your question, but there's certainly a sense if there was a better understanding of what was going on both sides. You wonder what how that could have affected, changed things.
Can
Is that
I
close
take
to
a
what
whack?
you're asking? I hope. Yeah.
Can I take a whack at that since Brian mentioned me? The Soviets understood that we were afraid, and they took advantage of our fear of nuclear weapons. But they didn't understand that if you make us fearful, we are going to build lots of them in response. And that they didn't understand our domestic political situation. So what they ended up with is they helped create a behemoth, a nuclear behemoth, by pretending that they were ahead in the nuclear arms race. What we didn't understand was that the Soviets were fearful of us. The Soviets were competing with us, and they had imperial aspirations, and we had some hegemonic aspirations too. But the difference was they were really afraid of our power, and they knew we were ahead. And that's something we didn't understand. We just didn't. And so the efforts of the US government to tell the Soviets, hey, look, let's not have these crises because we basically had the same amount of nuclear weapons, actually scared them even more. And the effect of that was to get Khrushchev to put missiles in Cuba. He puts missiles in Cuba not to defend the Cuban Revolution as much as to be able to make Americans fearful, because he believed that deterrence was only through a balance of fear. What the Soviets didn't understand about us was they didn't actually understand our democratic system at all. And so they believed that once the United States military understood that the Soviets were weak, that the United States would launch a first strike. They had no understanding whatsoever of the nature of civilian control of the United States military, not at all. Which I've read, their intelligence on this country was crazy. And so they didn't understand us and we didn't understand them, which doesn't mean we would have had global detente that was deeper than we achieved in that era, but we would have, I think, avoided some of the crises that occurred. But we just did not understand each other. And I think that was what Brian and his team were getting at in that period. We didn't need to be as fearful as we were of each other, but we were in that period. And that's one of the reasons I asked my colleagues about Russian bluff, because Putin is a creature of that world. He's not old enough to, been anyone of consequence in the Khrushchev era, but he's a creature of a world where the Soviets were behind and needed to scare Americans to be equal, to have parity. And I wonder how much of his approach to dealing with us is actually a product of the utility of making us fearful by constantly threatening to do things he doesn't intend to do, just as Khrushchev didn't intend to do. I mean, in the nuclear world. But of course, who knows, and who wants to take the risk that a bluff is not a bluff? Is there another question? Yes, go ahead, sir.
Doug Ollivant with FPRI. In the film towards the end, I didn't catch her name, but you had a woman on the screen who talked about how we've lost our terror or level of seriousness.
Mary Zarate, I think.
Yeah, exactly. About nuclear weapons. I think I'm probably the youngest person in the room who can remember when introduction to international relations was 75% deterrent theory. And when I talk to people a couple of decades or two my junior about deterrence theory, I sometimes feel like, well, look, you need to go watch The Day After twice and then put 99 Luftballons on loop for a couple hours and then we can have a conversation. But you just talked about how perhaps we were overly fearful in the 80s. And I'm interested in, from all four of you, are those of us who grew up in the 80s under that regime and that type, are we too fearful about nuclear weapons and too cautious about deterrence theory? Or do perhaps we need to caution our 20 and 30 and 40-year-old juniors that this needs to be taken more seriously, and perhaps you don't really understand or aren't taking seriously enough the consequences of a failure of deterrence theory.
I just want to make a note. Certainly, I wasn't arguing that we exaggerated
And
the
I'm
threat
not
of
saying you
nuclear
did.
weapons.
I just
It
pulled
was
your
the
quote.
Soviet. I think the key was whether the Soviets wanted war, and they didn't. That's the key. We learned this through this when we saw these Soviet records. They didn't want nuclear war, and we sure as heck didn't want it. But we didn't understand the extent to which both sides didn't want it, and that's what led to fears.
Yeah, my fundamental question is: are we too scarred, or are they too blasé?
No. Can I take that?
Go ahead.
They're too blasé. I mean, I think, you know, what we did, what we did have, and I almost remember duck and cover exercise. I mean, we had a healthy sense of fear, and certainly, again, talking about leaders. I mean, look at what happened after the Cuban missile crisis, after we came that close, and two leaders in adversarial countries decided that wasn't the path they wanted to be on, and launched, CTBT, test bans, NPT, all the strategic arms control agreements. I think, the public isn't really is pretty complacent about this. The Ukraine crisis has awakened a little bit of, interest and concern, as have things like Oppenheimer, your film, a couple of other, series. But I actually worry, we also seem to forgetting why non-proliferation is in the US interest. So I actually worry, George Shultz, not that long ago, before he died, I don't know, sometime in the last decade, testified before Congress and said he was really worried that we'd lost our sense of dread. And I think we see this. I worry about a new generation of policymakers and practitioners and experts who seem pretty cavalier about the idea of tactical nuclear weapons, the idea that you can control, have a limited nuclear conflict and control it. Overconfidence and deterrence not breaking down. And now, as I said, there's even a small little flourishing, group of people who are saying things like, well, why would it be bad for our allies, for Japan or for South Korea to have nuclear weapons? Why shouldn't our allies have weapons and help us with our adversaries? So I think there is a real loss of understanding of these issues, and a complacency about the destructiveness of these weapons, the inability to control them, and the consequences if we go down that path.
Andy?
What Lynn said.
Brian, you want to say something to that?
No, I think that sounds right. I mean, we are in this weird world where we are, where Putin is making this incursion into Ukraine, taking a bet that we're not going to engage in a nuclear exchange with him, and pushing the boundaries as far as it can go. So, I mean, in very broad sense, the deterrence or mutually assured destruction is, it seems like a losing path eventually, because as long as as Elizabeth Eve says in the piece, as long as we have these nuclear weapons around, at some point they're going to use them by mistake or on purpose, or they're going to get used. And so I don't know if I had anything kind of more to add. I do think, actually, I'm curious if that China won't engage in this discussion until there's parity. This is what I've heard. Is that Liz probably knows this better than I.
Well, I think there's been an oversimplification of China's nuclear buildup, which is focused on their triad, their strategic nuclear weapons. We never talk about what China isn't doing. They're not deploying tactical nuclear weapons. They're not changing their doctrine towards this idea of limited nuclear warfighting. And Russia, under Putin, sort of started this direction of doctrine, making it okay to use nuclear weapons first in a limited scenario. It was called the escalate to de-escalate policy. And we've started to mimic that. And I think we need to take a step back and, remember the lessons of the INF Treaty, that it was these so-called smaller theater tactical nuclear weapons that were the most likely to be used. And once one nuclear weapon is used, preventing escalation and an all-out nuclear war is extremely difficult.
The middle table, you've been waiting. Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I'm Karen Alter from Northwestern University. I've only seen this episode of the documentary series. And so I found it interesting that for so long it was about the war in Ukraine, and then it switched to talking about Hiroshima and the nuclear threat. And so it's leading me to wonder a couple of things with Brian. When you bookend this, how is this linked to the nuclear part always part of that? And part of me is wondering, we've been talking about the Cold War, and we've been talking about the US and the Soviet Union and Russia and China, the greatest powers that will get to a mutually assured destruction capability. But yet the most likely proliferation that we have right now are a number of states that are not going to get to that ability. We have Pakistan and India that have had nuclear weapons for quite a while. And now we're going to have Iran. North Korea's had them for a while. It may get up to mad capacity. It may not. But so what do we think about then if we pivot to these other domains of these countries? Saudi Arabia then will probably acquire nuclear weapons, of these smaller countries that are not tied into the same competition of how many nukes can we have, how many can we have mutually assured destruction? Do they lay out a threat posture of when they will use nuclear weapons? I just don't even really know how to think about these smaller size nuclear countries.
Someone want to take a swing at that? Lynn?
I'll take one swing. So I have a colleague who likes to say that we have 9 single points of failure. And what he means by that is we have 9 leaders, 1 leader in each of 9 countries currently that have nuclear weapons, that have the sole authority to use nuclear weapons. And that's pretty scary when you think that it could happen intentionally, accidentally, due to miscalculation, due to deep fake, whatever. But you're right. I mean, in some ways, the more likely, well, at least we used to think, the more likely use cases are actually, South Asia, India, Pakistan, or North Korea, whose, missile and nuclear program is growing significantly, and there's no diplomacy around that at all. So, and you're right, too, that there's risk of additional proliferation with Iran's growing, they don't have weapons yet, but nuclear program, other countries in the Middle East who are eyeing that warily. And as I mentioned, we have countries who currently rely on the US extended deterrence and are wondering about the long-term reliability of the US and having internal debates like in South Korea about whether they should consider this. So it's a really dangerous world.
Unlike the world, we have a very strong regulated environment here, and we've come to the end of our allotted time.
That's a good transition.
I just invented it. I want to thank, well, first of all, I want to thank Brian for your genius and that of your team.
Thank you. Thank you.
So first of all, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And for the colleague from Northwestern, did you say there are 8 other episodes? Don't miss that. Lynn, Andy, it's been an honor and a privilege to be here with you today. Thank you for sharing your expertise and for your public service. And to the council, thank you, council. Thank all of you for attending tonight. And I hope to those of you who are from the Warnke family that Paul Warnke would have enjoyed, perhaps not the conclusions of tonight, but the seriousness with which we have dealt with these issues that he that he devoted his entire career to thinking about. So thank you all, and good night.